The journey of caring for a loved one who is living with dementia can be quite challenging. The aim of this podcast is to make caregiving less daunting and more fulfilling. On this platform, we share knowledge, understanding, and experiences. We enlighten, give hope, and encourage, and in the process, create positive awareness about different aspects of dementia. Welcome to my podcast, Dementia Caregivers Corner. My name is Juliah Ratladi. Dementia Care, how deep is your love?
In today's episode, we have a very special guest who is going to assist us to lay the foundation for this podcast. She is a lecturer and the program director of the MSc in Dementia program with the University of Hull, the program which I am currently studying. She worked for many years with people living with enduring mental health problems before training as a social worker. She then worked as a specialist social worker in dementia care with a particular interest in the ways in which the condition is experienced by and impacts upon LGBT people, which is also the topic of her PhD, which was awarded in 2008. Her principal focus in both teaching and research is on creative approaches to well-being, including using music as a healing intervention and empowering older people at risk of reduced well-being due to social isolation. Welcome to Dementia Caregivers Corner, Dr. Liz Price.
Thank you, Julia. Goodness me, I can't wait to hear what I've got to say now after that introduction. It's really nice to be here, and it's good to help to spread the word about dementia and to inform people about what it is and how people experience it.
Yes, that's the main point, really. So as we start, maybe we'd like to clarify something concerning our chat here. In what capacity are you?
Yeah, I think I need to make it clear that I'm not here in any official capacity representing any organisation or anything like that. What I'll say today is just my view, and it's a view that comes from my practice and my practice at the university as well. But other than that, it really is just my own perspective, which some people will agree with and some people won't, and that's absolutely fine, and as it should be.
Right, let's get on to it then. Liz, more than 4 years ago, I had no idea of what dementia is. I have never heard of the word dementia.
Okay.
Actually, we don't even have it in my own language. So if you're talking to somebody like me who has never heard of the word dementia or who have limited information about dementia, how do you explain dementia to them?
Sure. I think in the UK that we tend to think the whole world thinks the way we do about dementia. And that's clearly not the case. As you say, some cultures, some countries, although people there will experience what in the UK we call dementia, they won't call it that thing and they won't understand it in the same way. And I think we need to be really sensitive to those differences in perception. But at the same time, the person experiencing what in the UK we would call dementia is having the same experiences for themselves in any country. I guess the difference is that those experiences will be differently understood. And so the social response to those experiences, or what you might call symptoms, will be different depending on where you are in the world. But I think asking what is dementia it's an ostensibly really simple question, but as even just what we've just said suggests, it's got a really complex answer. And it would be a really easy question to answer if dementia was just one thing that affected people in the same way. Across the world. But whilst people's experiences will be similar, nothing really could be further from the truth, because dementia, it's not an easy question to answer, because dementia is many, many, many different things. And because of that, one of the ways that, certainly in the UK, that health professionals would describe the term dementia is a sort of an umbrella term. And it's an umbrella term that covers a whole range of categories in the same way that probably cancer does. So we know there are lots of different types of cancer, so breast cancer, lung cancer, etc. And dementia is like that. it's an overarching term for a whole range of different conditions. There are, so we understand, around 100 different types of dementia. And what we're talking about when we talk about dementia is really a group of illnesses, a whole range of illnesses that share some common features with each other. And so it's probably best to perhaps think of dementia as a syndrome rather than a specific illness. But to answer your original question, I think, and it's not a very helpful answer really, I think dementia is a bit of a ragbag diagnosis because it's all sorts of different things. But what it does represent are changes in a person's brain and changes in a person's cognitive condition. But those changes, and we'll get onto symptoms and later on, I think, I'm sure, but those changes are all experienced differently depending on any number of factors. And there could be factors that are intrinsic to the person, so something that's about their brain and their body, but often it's factors that are outside the person, social factors, economic factors, family factors, the way that people are treated because of these cognitive changes that happen in the brains of people with dementia. So there's a whole range of things that make the experience of dementia completely different depending on where you are in the world, who you are, what your ethnicity is, how old you are, all those different things. But the very simple answer is dementia is a condition which causes changes in a person's brain, which means their cognition is compromised. I think that's the simple answer. It's a really complicated question.
Yes,
but I think that's probably the simple answer, Julia.
Yes, I hear that. I understand that. And then I've heard of cases of where people don't want to go for maybe memory clinics to get tested because they are afraid of being diagnosed with dementia because they're associated with mental illness. Is dementia a mental illness?
I think that, again, is all our questions today, I think, are really complex. But I think dementia is one condition that sits really uneasily on the borders between mental illness, if you want to call it that, and an organic problem. Because, again, and this is only my point of view, I think, and I would prefer to term mental illness mental distress. Again, that's just the language that I would use. But I think for people who experience mental distress or mental illness, for me, there's no proven organic or biological changes in a person's body that points to them having that mental illness or that mental distress. So we're not saying that that doesn't exist in any sense. But what I'm saying is there's lots of reasons for that distress. And I think in dementia, why I say it sits rather uneasily in this question is because in dementia there are very definite and observable changes in a person's brain that result in the experiences or the symptoms, again, that you might use the word symptoms, associated with dementia. But I think one of the ways that mental distress and dementia really do go hand in hand is because of the amount of social stigma that attaches to anything in society that we kind of don't understand or that makes people's behaviours difficult to understand. I think we as a society like to push that away and say, well, they must be mentally ill, there must be something wrong with them. And that creates a huge amount of social stigma. And I think that is, as I say, one of the key links between mental distress and dementia. In terms of people's social experiences, they have a pretty rough time, really.
Yes, talking about stigma, the way stigma is experienced back home, where I'm coming from, and even the articles that I have read during my study says that people in the sub-Saharan Africa consider dementia as something that is evil. So what you would find out, you can go on social media and find somebody being abused, somebody being humiliated because they are believed to be witches. Then how do you experience stigma and dementia in the UK?
Yeah, I think stigma is kind of operationalized differently depending on your culture and your traditional beliefs and perhaps faith as well comes into that for some people.
Yes.
And I think again, you have to be so careful not to be sort of completely Eurocentric about this. But I think when people hear what you've just said, that people are presumed to be witches and are abused, people in the UK would say, oh, that's terrible. And undoubtedly it is, because people are unwell. And I would say that's simply not the case. They are unwell. They have an organic condition that makes them behave and think and struggle in the ways that people do. And again, in the UK, we'll say, oh, how very terrible. But then in the UK, stigma is certainly there. It's just operationalized differently. So people with dementia may find themselves socially isolated. They often find it difficult to carry on with their life as they'd like to, because social pressure, I think worldwide, we live in a kind of hyper-cognitive society, don't we, where everything has to be super fast, everything has to be instantaneous, and if it's not, we get very frustrated with it. And I think it's the same with people. People have to respond quickly and have everything firing fast. And I think that's it's a huge stress for us all. But I think if your cognition is impaired because of a problem with your brain, then it's even harder to do those things. And I think the stigma is definitely there. It is just operationalized differently. But I think from what you're saying, I'm taking as read what you're saying, that the stigma you're talking about is more overtly dangerous to somebody, probably than it is in the UK. The one message to get across, I think, in this podcast is that dementia is, whatever you call it or whatever you don't call it, it is a problem with your brain that impacts on your ability to engage in the world. And it has a whole range of social and personal, psychological consequences. But what it's not is a demon or the articulation of witchcraft, any of those things. And I can completely understand why people would think that, because dementia is difficult to understand, and it's really challenging for people to have, and it's really challenging to support somebody sometimes with dementia. But I think we really have to get our heads around that. We have to get our heads around the fact that it's an illness, a condition that affects people in different ways. So in some senses, to go back to your original question, it's easier to say what dementia isn't, because it isn't witchcraft, it isn't demons. What it is a wide-ranging umbrella condition that affects people in lots and lots of different ways. But what people need is our support, not our censure and our kind of social abuse, as you just described it so well, Julia. I'm really passionate that we should be able to support people, not ostracize them, not push them out. We should draw people in when they're struggling. That's when, I don't want to proselytize, but that's when we genuinely show our humanity, when we draw people in who are struggling. We can't afford as a society to push people out.
It really warms my heart to hear you saying that, making it clear that dementia is an illness. It's not about witchcraft or evil forces that some of us associated with. Really, it warms on my heart. I believe someone who is listening or is going to listen to this podcast will get that from it.
I hope so. I really hope so.
Yeah.
But again, traditional belief systems are super important because they've sustained communities, they've sustained cultures through, the millennia. Yeah. But I think it's something like dementia that really challenges us to kind of think about our belief systems, whether they are in sub-Saharan Africa, whether they're in the UK or in the USA, wherever in the world.
Yes.
Things like dementia challenge us to look at our society and think, okay, well, are we doing the right thing by members of our society who are struggling? Because there'll be other people in sub-Saharan African countries who struggle in other ways, who are pulled in, who are supported and helped. And I wonder what it is about dementia that means that people are ostracized and stigmatized. And for me, it is about people whose experiences we find so difficult to understand, like people with enduring mental health problems, like people with dementia. It's hard to understand when people behave in ways that we kind of don't get. And sometimes it's easy to say, right, well, you're not like me, you're possessed by a witch or you have a demon.
Yeah.
It's easier to say that and push them away than to say, okay, well, this is part of the human condition and this is something that happens to many, many people. And the older you are, the more likely you are to get dementia. So if you're lucky to get very old, then that could also be you in a few years. And I think we need to remember that, because dementia makes us question our basic humanity. I really think it does.
It does. I saw one video on Twitter. I think this lady got lost and got into another person's house,
Right.
and they found her, and all they could do was abusing that lady. To them, it didn't just click into them that this person might be ill. To them, it was like she said, well, she came to bewitch us. It was so sad.
Sure.
Yeah.
But also quite scary if somebody walks into your house who is uninvited. And I guess we would all be taken aback by that. But again, it just requires that extra thought,
Yes.
an older lady coming into your house. It's highly unlikely she's going to rob you. If she seems quite confused, which can be one of the symptoms of dementia, then it's likely that she needs some support, not abuse.
She does. Earlier, you mentioned dementia is an umbrella word. So it means I've actually read somewhere that there are more than 200 types of dementias.
Lots and lots, yeah.
Yeah. So would you mind share with the listeners the most that are the common ones, and maybe the distinct?
Sure. I think the most common is Alzheimer's disease. Statistically, the most common is Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, so we're told, is caused by, again, problems in the brain. I don't want to get too scientific because I'm not able to do that anyway, but there's tau protein causes problems in the brain, which creates things called plaques and tangles in the brain. And if you look at the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, once they've died, you can actually see bits of brain tissue that are sort of squished up together. That's definitely not a scientific term, squished up together. But the tau protein effectively helps destroy healthy brain tissue. And that's what causes Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
I think the second, probably most common form of dementia is vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is caused by problems in the cardiovascular system. So things like stroke. So somebody who has vascular dementia will have a big stroke or a series of mini strokes that again destroy parts of the brain. And with Alzheimer's disease, there's always decline, but it tends to be quite slow and sort of steady. That's entirely the wrong word, but with vascular dementia, it tends to be much more of a step-like process, because somebody will be okay for a while, and then they'll have a mini stroke or a larger stroke. Their capabilities will drop significantly. And then they go along that trajectory for a while until the next cardiovascular incident. So it's a different presentation, I think, than Alzheimer's disease in that context.
Okay.
And probably, I'll just say the top three, if you like. Probably the third most common dementia, I think, would be dementia with Lewy bodies. And that again has a slightly, people's symptoms of Lewy body dementia are slightly different than they are with either Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. But, the global effects of any of the dementias can be quite similar in that people struggle to maintain their daily life. They struggle with their cognition, they struggle with sleep, they struggle with memory, they struggle with I'll talk through some of the symptoms, because as I said earlier, dementia is really a broad church, and whatever type of dementia you've got, you will experience it differently. So even if you have 10 people with Alzheimer's disease, they'll all have a different experience of dementia. There's a person who lives in a village not far from where I am here called Wendy Mitchell, and she's become quite famous. She's a best-selling author. She's written 3 books now about her experience of living with dementia.
Yes.
And she famously says, if you've met one person with dementia, then you've met one person with dementia. You can't extrapolate anybody else's experience from one person, because everybody's experience is different. But there are some key features of dementia. So any of the dementias, whichever sort you've got, some of these key features are likely to be things that you experience. And one of those is day-to-day memory. We tend to think, certainly in the global north, we tend to think of dementia erroneously as problems with your memory, but that's really only one of the issues. But nonetheless, people tend to have difficulty with their memory if they have dementia. So things like recalling recent events, or People can often have problems with their prospective memory as well. So that's remembering to do something. So if you had an appointment, for example, you may well forget to go to that. In Alzheimer's disease in particular, memory is very interesting because many people have very poor short-term memory. So they perhaps can't remember what they did yesterday, for example, but they can remember what they did in 1982 on, a particular Thursday morning. And that's because certain parts of the brain that are being affected by dementia, their short-term memory is affected, but their long-term memory is not. And one of the ways you can very effectively engage with someone, even in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease, is to talk about the past, is to talk about things that the person does remember. So not to constantly tell them they're wrong because they don't remember what happened yesterday, but to engage with them in a reality that makes sense to them. And that's perhaps something that happened in the past. Other kind of global issues in dementia would be orientation. So people sometimes forget where they are or not sure what time it is, not sure who people are. So familiar people sometimes become unfamiliar to that person. They can certainly remember how they feel about somebody, but they're not able to actually identify perhaps who that person is. People may have difficulty with concentrating, with planning, sequencing things, and sort of general life organization, really, have trouble with those sorts of things. And in lots of the different sorts of dementia, people often have trouble with language as well. So difficulties in expressing how they feel in terms of naming things. People will say, I have a pen here, for example. So people will say that thing that you write with, that thing that you write with, they can't remember the name for the thing, but they can remember what you do with it. And people will perhaps have trouble with sort of visual spatial skills. So trouble judging distances, seeing objects in 3 dimensions as well. And people may start to have falls and stumbling because they're not able to understand the environment perhaps as well as they used to do. So, as I say, those are the sort of umbrella things that identify any of the dementias. In terms of the different conditions, you're absolutely right, there are many. But I think the important point is to remember that whatever sort of dementia a person's got, their experience is completely individual. I think it's important as well to talk a little bit about how we classify dementia. And there has to be dementia, a person's experience needs to kind of meet a certain criteria. Certainly in the UK, if you were going to be diagnosed with dementia, your experiences need to meet a certain criteria. And one of those is that your symptoms, I will call them symptoms, your symptoms need to be progressive. And that's what happens with dementia. It doesn't get better. No. It gets worse over time. There are lots of reversible causes of changes in memory and cognition. And when people are being assessed for dementia, one of the first things that people do is rule out any of the treatable causes. So somebody may have anemia, they may have diabetes, they may have a urinary tract infection. All those physical things can impact on our cognition and our memory, if you like. But once those things are ruled out, it's looking more and more likely that a person may well have dementia. So it needs to be progressive, it gets worse, and it needs to impact more than one area of a person's cognition. So, as I said earlier, dementia isn't just about forgetting things. It isn't just about memory loss. But because some people can have dementia with a completely intact memory, depending on the type of dementia they've got. It just depends where the damage in the brain occurs. And if, for example, they have very mild memory loss, then that's termed mild cognitive impairment rather than dementia. So that's a possibility as well. But as I say, it needs to be progressive. The other criteria is that it needs to impact on one or more areas of a person's cognition. And finally, I think most importantly, the final criteria is that it needs to impact on a person's day-to-day life. And if someone has dementia, it will do. Because we all have memory loss at different points. We all go upstairs and forget our keys and all those sorts of things. But they're just little fluctuations in memory and our thinking. We can all forget to go to an appointment. And I'd hate anybody listening to this to think, oh, well, I forgot my appointment at the GP last week, so I must have dementia. That is not the case at all.
Yeah.
It's much more of a global impact on a person's cognition, and it will have an impact on their day-to-day life, and that's the final criteria. So for a diagnosis of dementia to be made, very often the changes observed in that person are judged to have a real impact on their well-being and their safety, because they're not able to go about their daily life as they ordinarily would.
Yes.
Sorry, I've talked a lot there.
Yes, it's fun because we want to take this information we're talking to someone who have limited information on dementia. So I'm happy that you're talking a lot.
Okay.
Yes, now coming back to, there are some behavioral and psychological symptoms that they experience. My grandma, I'm not sure what she died of, but the first time when I came in contact with people who are living with dementia, I quickly picked up the behavioral and psychological symptoms, because I saw my grandma picking up things from the floor, holding things, accusing people of stealing from her.
Yeah.
So some of those symptoms are on top of what you just said. Because you mentioned some. Yeah.
I think those are the things that people find most difficult to understand. I think you can think about dementia in a sort of quite an abstract way and say there's one of these symptoms that are this, this, and this, and you think, oh, okay, yes, that makes sense. Person goes off and gets diagnosed. But actually, the day-to-day experience that includes the things you just said, they're the hardest things to manage. Because if, for example, your grandma is saying, well, you've stolen my ring, and gets very distressed about that, and you say, no, grandma, why would I steal your ring? And you get in a real fight about it. Whereas actually, the reason she's perhaps saying that is because the ring is lost. She can't find where she's put it. And, if something goes missing, what are we to think? We panic and we get upset, because if you lost your ring, or I lost my wedding ring, for example, I'd be very, very upset and think, where on earth is it? And get very distressed. And one of the things I think about is, well, maybe somebody has stolen it, because I can't remember putting it somewhere. I can't remember what I did with it. So the next best explanation really is that somebody's stolen it. So in a way, there's a real logic to that, because it's not there. We've lost it. It's gone. So I'm scared that it's gone, and I'm worried. And what is the explanation for that? There's the whole mental process goes on. But outside of that, what we see is, you've stolen my ring. No, I've not. And there's a whole thing ensues because of that. Whereas in actual fact, the person who's been accused, it's hard, but you need to stand back and maybe say, well, grandma, let's look for your ring. Rather than saying, no, I haven't stolen it, let's engage with the fact that it's lost, as opposed to what we're being accused of. And that is really hard to do. It's really hard to do because it feels out of character for our grandma, doesn't it? And those symptoms that you talk about, the behavioural symptoms, if you like, of dementia, are the hardest things to deal with. But when you take a step back and look at it from the other person's point of view, there's a real logic to that. People holding on to things. Well, when you are distressed, when you're not sure what's going on, you're frightened, you're scared, because it's scary. People know that things are happening. They know they're forgetting things. They know that something's happening for them. It's terrifying. It must be terrifying. And when you're scared, what do you want to do? You want to hold on to things, and you want your mum. And so lots of people with dementia will say, well, I want to see my mum. Where's my mum? And my mum must be coming now. And we know that person's mum died 30 years ago. But telling them that the person is dead is not helpful, because if you were to say to me, well, your mum's just died, I would be so distressed and so upset. You're creating a grief reaction in somebody every time you tell them that person's dead. So instead of insisting that that person sees our reality, let's try to engage with theirs. So we have to try to look for the meaning behind what somebody's saying. So we know that person's mum is dead, but what does the mum mean to that person? What does mum mean to all of us? Mum, hopefully, means love and care and lovely food and nurturing. And if you're scared, that's what you need, isn't it? So rather than telling the person, well, your mum's dead, she's not coming now, rather say, what was your mum's name and what does mum mean? Would you like a hug? Let's go get some tea and a cake and we'll sit and talk. We'll talk about this. It's easy to do. In one sense, it's very easy to do, but it does require a very different mindset from the person who doesn't have dementia. And it's about engaging in another person's world and starting where they are rather than starting where we are. And again, I think that's a really important message today, and one that is very, very difficult to actually operationalize, to do.
Thank you very much. It makes me feel sad because I see all this that you're talking about.
Of course,
yes, and we having to talk with the public or the community to say, go in their world.
Absolutely.
Are there any risk factors? Are there any causes of dementia? Risk factors, certain lifestyles?
Yeah, I think at the moment there's a real increasing interest in what are termed modifiable risk factors in dementia. And the research tells us that there are things we can do to limit our risk of dementia. Now, that's kind of all well and good, but one of the risk factors, for example, is, having a good and healthy diet. So not eating too much saturated fats, not eating too much sugar, keeping our cardiovascular system healthy. Because as I say, vascular dementia, for example, is caused by problems in the cardiovascular system. But, if you come from somewhere where it's not possible to afford what we might term a healthy diet, then the question remains, well, how are you supposed to do that? How are you supposed to eat, 30 sorts of vegetables every half hour or whatever it is we're supposed to do these days? It's not possible because you don't have access to those vegetables and you can't afford to cook them. So you can see there are real problems with modifiable risk factors, but nonetheless, one of them is education. So the research tells us that the better educated you are, however you interpret that, the less likely you are to have dementia. So I guess that's a risk factor that could be addressed very early on in somebody's life, right from the point at which they start school. Another one is smoking. So don't smoke because it's really bad for you and will kill you. Probably before anything else does. But again, it's bad for your cardiovascular system. So smoking, obesity, physical inactivity, air pollution, diabetes, and depression, believe it or not. Those are some of the risk factors for dementia. That's what the research is telling us. I guess I always look at things as a sociologist, really, as much as anything else. And I think what we need to think about are the social consequences of thinking about dementia as an avoidable condition, because we have to ask ourselves, what does that then mean for people who are diagnosed with dementia? Have they not tried hard enough to avoid it? And when we ask the question in that way, it seems, that would seem very unfair indeed. And the biggest risk factor for dementia, and it's not modifiable at all, only by death, is age. The older you are, the more likely you are to have dementia. It does affect younger people, and increasingly, certainly in the UK, increasingly people are being diagnosed with dementia earlier and earlier. But the fact remains that the older you are, the more likely you are to have dementia. So yes, there are some modifiable risk factors, and the main ones are diet, smoking, obesity, etc. But the main factor, the main risk for dementia, and one you can't do anything about, is age. And certainly in the UK, if you're over 90 years of age, I think you have a 1 in 2 chance of having dementia. So yeah, some modifiable factors, some definitely not.
Okay, let's talk about early diagnosis. I was reading something on Alzheimer's UK website of the new drug that was found, and the CEO said something. Let me read her quote. She said, after that new drug, she said it's a breakthrough in the dementia field. But then she continued to say, this is a defining moment for dementia research, but new treatments could mean nothing if we do not fix dementia diagnosis. How important is early diagnosis for people who might be living with dementia?
That's a tough question. And this is entirely my own opinion. But yes, I think diagnosis is a very fluid thing. I think it's very elastic. And you can diagnose dementia very early on in somebody's life. But my question would be, as she says, unless we have treatments for whatever it is we're diagnosing people with, what is the point really? There has to be a point to diagnosis and there has to be a point to treatment. At some point they need to come together. And I think it is really important. Diagnosis is important because it allows people to plan ahead. It allows people to understand what's happening for them. And as much as anything else, it gives a name to people's experiences. It allows people to name them. And if you are really struggling with your cognition, if your day-to-day life is impacted by problems that are happening in your brain, sometimes it's really nice to have a name for that, because otherwise you think, what on earth is happening? What on earth is going on? Having a name gives it a form, and it gives it a form to manage, it gives it a form to treat, and it gives it a form to understand and to be able to present to other people and say, well, this is why this is happening. These are the areas in which I'm going to need some support. So it allows people to plan, and it allows people to understand. I think if you keep pushing the boundaries of early diagnosis, you then push the boundaries of what dementia is. Because as I said before, there's this thing called mild cognitive impairment, which, you know, as a menopausal woman, have that a lot. I forget all sorts of things and, you know, have this problem and that problem. But then nearly every woman of my age will do those things. That's not dementia. That's just being a middle-aged woman. That's one of those things. However, if we're saying, well, if you forget things and you forget appointments and your cognition is impacted in this way and that way, it means you've got early dementia. That's a bit terrifying. That's when early diagnosis becomes perhaps a little bit too elastic. And the problem is with creating new treatments for dementia, and this is the cynic in me, that the pharmaceutical companies will say, well, let's get as many people as we can diagnosed with this, and then we get the profits that we need. I'm a complete cynic, so people will probably completely ignore that view. But I don't know. It's a tricky one. And yes, diagnosis is important. I think we have to look quite critically at what diagnosis actually means and how far we go in pushing the boundaries of what we call dementia. Okay. If that makes sense.
It does. And you have listed them well, the one that I understand, the importance of early diagnosis. Yes. But I think we talked about the demographics in our chat, that those are prone to dementia, you know.
Yeah, I think, again, the older you are, the more likely you are to have it. There are certain genes that are passed down through families that can affect a person's chance of getting dementia. It's rare, but it does happen. There are certain genes. Women are more at risk of dementia than men. And that's precisely because women live longer than men. So generally, so women will be older. And as we've said, the older you are, the more likely you are to have dementia. So therefore, the men that were going to get dementia have died. So women are more at risk on that basis. There are a few studies, Julia, that say if you are from the Black African, Black Caribbean or South Asian communities, you're more likely to get dementia than people from white ethnic groups. There have been a few studies done that suggest that's the case. People from the South Asian community, for example, are statistically more likely to develop diabetes and cardiovascular disease as they get older for lots of different reasons, both social and medical. And as we've said, cardiovascular problems are key risk factors for dementia. So that's the reason why the South Asian community, for example, are more at risk from dementia. People with cardiovascular disease, whatever cultural group you happen to be from, people who have hearing loss are more at risk of dementia. And that's because people with hearing loss tend to be more socially isolated and have less what we call cognitive reserve. So cognitive reserve are the things you do with your brain during your lifetime that create a reserve of cognition. So I'm making that sound far more complicated than it should be. I suppose I'm saying the more you use your brain in certain ways, the more protective that is. I'm not saying everyone needs to do Sudoku or crosswords every day, but there are certain things that create a degree of protection against dementia in your brain. And if you have hearing loss, you're less likely statistically to have done those things, and you're more likely to be socially isolated. People who have traumatic brain injury, also much more likely to get dementia. And here we can think about footballers and people who play rugby. And I think there's an increasing, certainly in the UK, there's an increasing focus on continual head injury in sports like football, soccer and rugby. And there, statistically, again, you're more likely to have dementia if you have a long-term condition such as multiple sclerosis or HIV and AIDS. So there are things that increase your likelihood of getting dementia, and there are things you can do to try and limit your risk of dementia as well, as we said earlier.
It's funny how I remember in module 1, we had an activity that we had to come up with words that pops into our mind when we heard the word dementia.
Yeah.
And for me, I wrote Northern Hemisphere. Why? Because I thought dementia is just this side. Because I thought I had never seen anyone with dementia where I am coming from. Yes.
Julia, so, where are you from originally?
I'm from Botswana in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
So what you were saying is that dementia does not discriminate. It's not
absolutely
something for the white, not something for the black.
No, absolutely not. In fact, if you're not white, as I've said, you're statistically more likely to get dementia. I don't know what the statistic is, I'm sorry, but you are at more risk because of a range of social and medical factors. So yes, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate. It's everywhere in the world, because if we're saying that the older you are, the more likely you are to have dementia, then dementia is usually a diagnosis that happens in much older age. So if you have older people in your community, you will have some degree of dementia in your community. There is no question about that whatsoever.
Yeah.
What's different, as we've said right at the start, is how the community responds to that and how the community understands it. But it is the same thing. Whether we call it witchcraft or we call it dementia, it's the same thing.
Yes.
And people have the same needs for support and care and understanding. Those are the 3 really, really key words. That's what people need. Not censure, not abuse, and not pushing out of communities. We need to draw people in and embrace them and support and care for them. That's what we should do with people we love. That's what we do as human beings.
Yes. When you're talking of the statistics, I think I saw some current statistics in World Health Organization website. It said more than 60% of people living in low and middle income countries will have dementia.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we're talking about modifiable risk factors, people don't have access to, what we might term good food.
Yeah.
They tend to have unhealthier, again, however you define that, lifestyles. So there's a whole range of factors that mean maybe if you do live in a sub-Saharan country, maybe people are more at risk, as we said earlier, not less. So the focus on dementia and support and helping people to cope with these things needs to be greater there, not lesser.
Thank you. Let's not talk about dying or living well with dementia. Every time I post something on my social media platforms, I'll use different hashtags.
Okay.
And I remember posting something on LinkedIn, and one of the hashtags that I used was living well with dementia. And somebody commented on my post and said, living well with dementia? Is that even possible?
Absolutely.
So how do you explain that to that lady who thinks it's not possible?
One of the activities that we do on the course, which you may remember, is that we ask people to do a kind of a living well inventory, so for ourselves. And we ask our students to think about what a good life means to them, not to anybody else, just for them, just for us. So what does a good life mean? And what are the qualities of a good life? And how do you make that good life? What are the building blocks that make a good life? And then we ask what promotes or is a barrier to a good life? And what services or support or sort of community amenities do you need to be in place to enable you to live a good life? And obviously, the answers to these questions are completely different for everybody. But the answers to those questions help answer the question, what does living well with dementia mean? Because when we do that living well inventory for ourselves, it's the same inventory for everybody. Everybody wants a good life. Everybody understands the qualities of what a good life means for them. And that doesn't stop when you have a diagnosis of dementia. So what is a good life for you and a good life for me is probably very similar to what a good life is for somebody with dementia. And we just all want to have that. Everybody wants the same thing. So I guess living well with dementia means maximizing your physical, mental and social well-being. irrespective of whether you have dementia, whether you have multiple sclerosis, whether you have HIV, maximising your ability to live as well as you possibly can. And that might be limited by your condition. It might well be. But again, I'll quote Wendy Mitchell. She has a blog, and anybody who's actually interested in learning more about dementia, have a look at Wendy's blog, because you will learn more there than anywhere else. The blog's called Which Me Am I Today? And I would highly, highly recommend anybody has a look at that. Wherever you are in the world, as long as you've got access to the internet, you will be able to see that. And she has a definition of what it means to live well. And she says, it means living as well as you can with dementia. And it's all about adapting to new ways to enable us to live better for longer with dementia. And so it is perfectly possible to live as well as you can with dementia. Whether somebody else would perceive that as living well is kind of immaterial. You do the best you can with what you've got. And I think that quote is perfect, really. And Wendy offers a real insight into what it is to live well. She has so many strategies that help her to fight back against dementia, but also to recognise that when dementia, say in one particular day, is just overwhelming, then it's overwhelming, and you have to accept that fact sometimes. But on the days when it isn't, you get on with it, you live as well as you can, you do what you can do. And with any condition, I think, as human beings, that's what we do. Our new reality with a health problem is just that. It is a reality, but it doesn't mean that we can't live as well as we can with that new reality. Dementia is not a diagnosis of despair. Dementia means that things need to change, and that people's lives and expectations will be different. And you live with dementia. It's something that you live with, and you live as well as you can with. And that would be, I think, Wendy's. I hope that would be when I'm quoting her. I hope I'm quoting her correctly. I think that would be Wendy's perspective.
Yes. When you're saying it's not all about gloom, when
Absolutely.
I'm talking to dementia caregivers in my chat, I always ask them to mention something that makes them happy to take care of their loved ones.
Mm.
So when you're talking of living well, Liz, we're all going to have to look at caregivers, because those are the ones that are now going to assist you to live that life.
Yeah.
Well, yes, the importance of caregiver support.
I think supporting people who support people with dementia is absolutely crucial. And it's one thing that I think is often missed out in our understanding of dementia. So we have our health professionals, we have the person with dementia, and they work together to try and enable a person to live as well as possible. But there's a whole ecology around that person. We can't see the person with dementia just on their own. They have family, they have friends, they have community. So you've got a person in the middle of like a circle, and then a whole range of other people around them. And I think it's really important for caregivers to understand that sort of ecology of care, and try and reach out, or to be enabled to reach out, to have other sources of support as well. You can't do it all on your own. It's too hard sometimes. People need support to be able to provide support, and I think services could probably do a lot better at that. But charities do an amazing job locally. Here in the UK, in Hull, there's a charity called Butterflies Charity, and they do an amazing job, not just of supporting people living with dementia, but their caregivers as well. Everybody is drawn into that care and support that the charity offer. As I say, they do an incredible job. But I guess support for caregivers is one area that probably needs lots more thought and lots more work. I don't know how we do that. I don't know how that's funded, but it's critical, because people cannot do it all on their own. We need to draw, in my view, much more on community sources of support for people living with dementia. And again, to be able to do that, the community needs to understand what dementia is, and not what it's not.
Yes, definitely. Yes. And then, do we need more research in dementia?
Again, purely personal opinion, but there's a lot of research in dementia, but there's a lot of research that is kind of looking for a cure and looking to stop us getting dementia.
Okay.
And for me, I think if some of that money were put into research that looked at how we support people better who have dementia, and importantly, as we've just said, how we support carers better, some research that helps us understand what people need to be able to support somebody with dementia better. So money that goes into supporting and caring for people with dementia and their supporters and carers. I think if some of the money from the research that's desperately looking for a cure could go into helping the people who've already got it more, for me, that would be money well spent. But again, personal opinion, because let's be honest, if we did get a cure, how amazing would that be? But they've been looking for a long time, haven't they? And we're still not there yet. We're still not there yet.
I know, yes, but thank you for that. So when, as we come to the towards the end of our chat, is there any other thing that you want us to talk about that I didn't ask you? Because we want to create more awareness. Really.
Sure. I think the only thing we've not kind of touched on, and it's in the context of living well, we need to think about dying well with dementia as well. And it's a bit of a taboo because as a society, we really don't like to talk about death, do we? As if it's actually not going to happen. It's the only thing that 100% is going to happen to all of us, but it's the one thing we kind of don't talk about at all. And everybody who has a diagnosis of dementia will die with dementia because dementia is not going to go away. So they'll either die from something associated with dementia or something separate, but they will definitely die with dementia. And I think one of the things that we really need to focus on is that process and enabling people to plan for death. And this goes for everybody, not just people with dementia. As a society, we need to plan for death much better than we do. But if you have dementia, you need to be given the opportunity, the time to plan for that. And that's enabling people to make things like advanced care plans so that when we are supporting someone with dementia, if they're not able to communicate with us in ways that we find easy to understand, we have those things documented. We know what they want at the end of life, and we can meet their needs and grant their wishes as best we can. If we never give people the chance to think about death, then how do we do that? People's deaths won't be what they want, and people will die in hospitals where, again, research tells us people don't want to be. They will die in ways that are anathema to what they actually want. So when we're thinking about living well, we need to think about dying well as well. And that's one of the things we do on our course. Of course, we have a whole module on dying well with dementia. And I think
I'll tell you,
really important.
Sorry to disturb you. Yes, I'm really looking forward for the Death Cafe. I think our tutors have organized that.
Yes, they have.
Yes,
they have. Yeah,
I'm wondering how.
The Death Cafe is, you'll enjoy it, Julia. Enjoy it's probably the wrong word, but I think
yes.
It's a concept that opens up the possibility of having some of the conversations that we never have. We have one a year, and it's always a really interesting and thought-provoking event. It's hard because talking about death is challenging, but the people, my colleagues at our local hospice who facilitate the Death Cafe are very skilled, and I think maybe we should have a podcast about the Death Cafe as well. I think you'll enjoy it. You'll be all right.
All right, I'm looking forward to it. Yes. Any other thing that you want to talk about?
I don't think so. I think only to say that it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. You know, obviously you're a student on the course that I work on, but it's not often we get the opportunity to actually have a protracted conversation about something that interests us both. So it's been really fun, and I appreciate the opportunity. I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming through.
No worries, Julia.
Dementia Care. How deep is your love?